the Climate Fairplay. This episode explains how our current food system is failing. We then break down climate-smart agriculture, focusing on why it's beneficial and what the global backlash means for sustainable agriculture policies. As always, we end the episode discussing how we can move climate progress on a local level. In this episode, we'll explore how just one community-level policy change can increase the accessibility of locally grown food. Welcome to the Climate Fairplay Podcast, a series that shares the news, science, and stories that connect environmental issues in actionable ways. I'm Cody Sanford, an environmental journalist, trained ecologist, and host of this podcast. Remember, you can join the environmental discussions on places like Reddit, Instagram, and Threads. Search for Climate Fairplay, which you can also find linked in the episode show notes. Subscribing on your favorite podcast platform is one of the quickest and, frankly, easiest ways to help sustain this podcast. So please hit the subscribe button. A picture of overly packaged pears is often recirculated on the internet. The picture focuses on the food labeling, which states grown in Argentina, packaged in Thailand, and the pears appear to be for sale in grocery stores in the United Kingdom. I think this captures the convoluted system that prioritizes profit, often at the expense of the environment. The food in our grocery stores is the result of a huge global system that we hardly ever consider. Before food arrives on the grocery shelves, it travels 1,300 miles on average. Agriculture employs 1 billion people, or a quarter of the entire workforce. There's a lot of money being made, and the industry is still growing. In 2024, agriculture is projected to account for $3.9 trillion. While few enjoy record profits, according to the World Health Organization, over 820 million people, or 10% of the world's population, go hungry daily. On top of this, agriculture is highly polluting, accounting for up to 37% of total global greenhouse gas emissions, and causes a staggering amount of environmental damage. The result of this food system in the US is obesity and malnutrition due to overly processed food not made for nourishment. This system ends with Americans throwing away nearly 40% of the food they purchase each year. This breaks down to each American contributing about 325 pounds of food waste a year, all while over 820 million people go hungry every day. This is a failure of the global food system, and I think these stats quickly summarize how agriculture needs reform. The United States and the European Union have invested in shifting to food systems that can better handle climate change and promote environmental sustainability. However, the EU faces backlash from farmers, and there are credible reports of US funding going to projects that will increase greenhouse gas emissions. Our food system is broken. Let's examine the ins and outs of climate-smart agriculture. By its very nature, agriculture works directly with the environment. Given this, the industry can have one of the most significant and fastest impacts on global sustainability. Before we discuss this more, I want to highlight in better detail the short-sighted nature of our current food system, which contributes to environmental damage and is vulnerable to the pressures of climate change. Agriculture relies on monoculture farming, the practice of growing a single crop over large areas. Some examples are the colossal corn and soy fields that cover the Midwestern United States, and palm oil plantations, Monoculture farming depletes soil nutrients. This reduces soil productivity and increases the reliance on chemical fertilizers. Monoculture farming makes the ecosystems vulnerable to climate-related disruptions and depends heavily on pesticides. Mentioning pesticides, the US uses over 1 billion pounds of pesticides each year. According to an agricultural health study, an estimated 16% of people who use pesticides in the US experience at least one instance of pesticide poisoning or high exposure during their lifetime. To state the obvious, pesticides contribute to biodiversity loss. They kill non-target species, including beneficial pollinators. Some of these pesticides remain in the environment for decades, which can harm the ecosystem long after their intended use. Pesticides are also a leading cause of water contamination. Studies show that over 90% of US streams and rivers contain detectable levels of one or more pesticides. Regarding water consumption, agriculture is the largest consumer of water resources. It accounts for 70% of global freshwater withdrawals. Runoff from agricultural fields is the leading source of nutrient pollution in water bodies, contributing to harmful algal blooms and dead zones in aquatic ecosystems. Animal agriculture produces large quantities of waste, which carry pathogens, antibiotics, and hormones into our waterways and pose a risk to human health and aquatic ecosystems. In some areas, intensive irrigation in agriculture has led to an overextraction of groundwater, causing significant declines in aquifer levels. To see these effects firsthand, I suggest looking up the Central Valley of California and the Ogallala Aquifer in the United States. The livestock industry is a prime target for climate adaptation. Livestock pollution accounts for over 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions and uses over 70% of agricultural land. Agriculture is also the cause of up to 80% of global deforestation. This land use change contributes to significant biodiversity loss and is the primary driver of global deforestation. Methane emissions from cattle are a significant contributor to climate change. Methane is over 25% times more potent than CO2 at trapping heat in the atmosphere, and cattle are the largest single source of methane emissions from human-related activities. We consume so many natural resources to produce our food, but up to 40% of the food produced globally is wasted. Having this much food go to waste is unsettling to think about when millions go hungry. To me, when the agriculture industry has grown as large as it has, and so much food is thrown away while millions go hungry, it shows our societies are making a choice to let people live without access to food. Current agricultural practices make food systems highly vulnerable to climate change. Extreme weather events like droughts and floods can devastate crops and livestock, threatening food security. In fact, studies show that climate change has already reduced food productivity by 21% since 1961. The areas with the greatest loss have been Africa and Latin America. According to the USDA, extreme weather events linked to climate change cost $12.5 billion in damages in 2022 alone. Global water scarcity is a legitimate concern. Studies found that increased severity of drought conditions is going to reduce crop yields by up to 50% in some parts of the world. To summarize, modern agriculture has seen remarkable productivity growth since the invention of synthesized fertilizers. It's boosted global food security and feeds billions of people. Yet, the agricultural sector now finds itself in a paradox. It will be one of the first major areas to experience the cumulative effects of climate change, while also being a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and environmental degradation. Without action, farmers will experience extended droughts, more resilient pests, and a decrease in soil fertility and water availability. Boosting climate-resilient agriculture practices is crucial for environmental sustainability. Let's discuss this approach to agriculture. But first, I want to highlight Agrivoltaics in this episode's Sharable Stats and Facts segment. Creating renewable energy grids is one of the most significant steps in meeting net zero energy targets, and expanding solar energy requires a lot more space. A study about the future of solar power by the U.S. Department of Energy found solar fields need to increase to 0.5% of land use. To put this in perspective, golf courses account for 0.1% of total land use in the U.S., so there needs to be 5 times the amount of land devoted to solar power compared to what the U.S. currently has ready for golfing. This changing land use has led to what I think is an exciting science: agrivoltaics. Agrivoltaics combines solar production with farming. It has been shown to boost energy resilience, cut carbon footprints, and diversify farmers' income. Produce grown under solar panels benefits from shade, reducing heat stress and water loss while cooling the solar panels, which improves the efficiency, a win for both the vegetation and solar output. Agrivoltaics can also increase biodiversity by providing habitat for pollinators. Livestock grazing is another popular agrivoltaic use for ranchers. The largest agrivoltaic project is a 10-acre wild blueberry field in Rockport, Maine. This generates 4.2 megawatts of renewable energy. Ecologists are studying how wild blueberries grow under solar panels, and most importantly, people get to eat blueberries. In 2023, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory found there were 314 agrivoltaic projects in the U.S. Finding dual uses for solar fields is a science that is developing rather fast since solar fields are going to expand. The U.S. Department of Energy estimates that by 2035, there will be 5.7 million acres of solar land use, with 1 terawatt of energy generating capacity. After listening, you might have guessed I captured this episode's cover photo at a small agrivoltaic project in Colorado. It's cool to see these sustainability efforts combine to improve agriculture and generate renewable energy. If you're looking for more information on agrivoltaics, I will link the sources for this episode's Sharable Stats and Facts segment at climatefairplay.com. You can also find it on social media with the handle Climate Fairplay. With the challenge of feeding a growing human population while adapting to climate change and cutting greenhouse gas emissions, global agricultural policies are shifting to climate-smart agriculture, technology and practices that enhance productivity and environmental resilience. Climate-smart agriculture focuses on nature-based solutions and regenerative agriculture, including cover crops, no-till soil management, agroforestry, crop diversification, organic fertilizers, and precision farming. These practices can mitigate environmental damage. For example, cover crops and no-till farming enhance soil fertility and reduce carbon emissions. Agroforestry integrates trees into the growing area, enhancing biodiversity and carbon sequestration. These measures improve long-term soil health, remove carbon pollution, and benefit water conservation. Research shows that climate-smart practices like these could sequester up to 1,000 pounds of carbon per acre a year. Sustainable agriculture also improves food nutrition. A recent study comparing climate-smart practices with the status quo found concentrations of micronutrients such as manganese were up to 3.6 times greater, and zinc was between 5 and 15 times more concentrated compared to produce grown in intensive agriculture practices. Raising soil quality contributes to healthier, more nutritious food, and sustainable growing environments. But one of the most compelling reasons to focus on climate-smart agriculture is its potential to feed millions more people compared to the current approach to agriculture. For example, in 2022, we had 2.4 billion people experiencing moderate or severe food insecurity, and over 3.1 billion people could not afford a healthy diet. That is according to a recent report by the UN FAO. Research shows that incorporating climate-smart agricultural methods will boost crop production. Corn production would increase by 47% and wheat by 42% by 2050. Wetting and drying rice fields also significantly removes greenhouse gases from rice production and can increase rice yields by 19%. These practices would significantly boost food security by ensuring a more abundant supply of essential staples. By 2050, according to business as usual projections, if we incorporate climate-smart agriculture, there would be 47 million fewer malnourished children and 385 million fewer people at risk of hunger. As you can see, climate-smart agriculture isn't an abstract idea. These relatively simple changes can have huge, lasting impacts on environmental sustainability and feed millions more people than our current system. The United States has invested nearly $8.5 billion in climate-smart agriculture funding targeting greenhouse gas emissions. Similar climate-focused agriculture legislation has passed in Europe. With the rise of climate-smart sustainable agriculture, there has also been controversy from all political directions. A credible report shows that only a fraction of U.S. projects effectively target emissions. The study also found that a large portion of the projects funded, such as livestock fencing, would increase emissions. In the EU, farmer objections to new agricultural policies escalated earlier this year. There have been wild reports of farmers blocking major roadways, flinging eggs, and even spraying manure at protests. Despite the overwhelming evidence showing how sustainable agriculture grows healthier food and can feed millions more people while removing greenhouse gas pollution, the funds to implement this change are being mismanaged in the US, and farmer tensions are already high before basically any climate policies have come into effect. Now, to better understand what this means for the future of a sustainable food system, let's get straight into the backlash against climate-smart policies. In a forward-thinking move, the United States has pledged billions in funding climate-smart agriculture practices, specifically procedures that sequester greenhouse gas emissions or remove them from the supply chain. Yet, a new report by the Environmental Working Group found that only a fraction of these funds are going into proven methods to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Some funding is likely going to projects that will increase emissions, like livestock fencing. This significant deviation raises questions about why the financial commitments and environmental goals aren't aligning for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In 2022, the United States passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which funds climate change mitigation. This included a nearly $8.5 billion investment in climate-smart agriculture to advance practices that remove carbon pollution from farming, like transitioning to cover crops and no-till soil management. The Environmental Working Group, a nonprofit organization, published a study examining EQIP, the federal program that pays farmers to switch to climate-smart practices. The Environmental Working Group found that between 2017 and 2022, the USDA only spent 31% of the billions allocated to recognize climate-smart methods. Most funding will go to land practices without proven strategies to combat climate change. Some funding even goes to waste storage facilities for animal waste and to livestock fencing. The data shows that these structures increase greenhouse gas emissions. The Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, invests about $19.5 billion in total to climate-smart agriculture. As I've mentioned, of which nearly $8.5 billion is explicitly meant for practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or sequester carbon. The data gap comes down to what the USDA includes on the Climate Smart Practices list, which added 8 provisional techniques not shown to sequester carbon or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Labeling livestock fencing and animal waste storage practices as climate smart, even provisionally, is problematic because the nearly $8.5 billion was allocated to practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The department plans to study the effectiveness of these provisional practices in 2024 to measure their greenhouse gas emission reductions, but I'm not holding my breath. All 8 provisional practices from the 2023 list remain on the list for 2024, still classified as provisional. Meanwhile, the EU is facing a completely different backlash. Building a sustainable food system is at the heart of Europe's plan to be the first continent to reach net zero emissions. EU's goal with the farm-to-fork strategy is to benefit the consumers, the producers, the climate, and the overall environment by enhancing sustainable practices at almost every step. The policy includes measures to promote organic farming, address soil nutrient loss, increase funding for biotech and sustainability innovations, and change food labeling to support sustainable and healthy food. The policy is being implemented when food producers are facing economic stagnation. Inflation from the pandemic continues, and Ukrainian imports are being sold at dramatically lower prices across Europe. And climate policies like ending farmers' tax breaks on diesel fuel are being enforced in some parts of the EU. The result of these tensions caused over 4,000 protests across European city centers. There are reports of tractors halting traffic, farmers flinging eggs, and even spraying manure. Europe has dropped the tariff requirement on Ukrainian imports, which has brought agricultural products that outcompete those grown by European farmers in terms of price at the store. One thing that pushed farmers to the streets was the advancement of a policy in Germany that removed tax breaks on diesel fuel used in agriculture. This is estimated to cost farmers €20,000 a year. In Brussels, when the EU was negotiating with Ukraine, farmers sprayed livestock manure across the streets, and it's even been reported onto the police. Amid the tension, the Advancing Sustainable Ag policy aims to bring the farming community along in a just transition, promising a future where both the planet and the farmers win. To add brief commentary, seeing such backlash from the farming community is not a good sign for the farm-to-fork policy. It's in part because of unfortunate timing, but I also think more work everywhere needs to be put in to help stakeholders understand that these sustainable policies are a good thing in the long term, even if there are growing pains now. For climate-smart, sustainable agriculture to be successful, food producers need to be elevated to the point of partners in policy decisions. Funding needs to actually go to projects that will remove carbon pollution from the food system. But it's not just rural farms that need attention. Urban agriculture is becoming a key focus in how we produce sustainable food in a changing climate. Currently, the US separates metro areas from where we grow food, and the food we eat usually travels 1,300 miles before it's ever for sale. It is strange to me that people are so far removed from the food that ends up on our grocery shelves. Changing laws to allow food to be grown for commerce in urban areas is a simple policy change that can increase the accessibility of locally grown food. I want to end the episode by bringing attention to community-supported agriculture systems. And I think the best way to tell you about community-supported agriculture, or CSAs, is to explain how I was introduced to them. I went to undergrad in Fort Collins, Colorado, which is a hub for community-supported agriculture. I was first exposed to the concept of CSAs by one of my professors, who operated a 3-acre farm in the center of the city. On the 3 acres of land, all through the spring and into the fall, he fed 300 families weekly with fresh, locally grown produce and free-range eggs, on land that people would have otherwise just grown grass or nothing at all. One reason this urban farm is possible is because the city of Fort Collins changed laws to allow people to grow food for commerce within the city limits. To grow food for commerce as a CSA, they do need to register with the city, but they let hens, beehives, and pygmy goats be cultivated without any additional permits. The city also allows residents to transition from growing grass lawns, which is a big deal because in the US, over 40 million acres are dedicated to growing lawns. More land in the US is devoted to growing grass than crops like corn. Grass requires an excess of water. On average, a 500 square foot area needs over 67 gallons of water a year. The EPA found that 50% of the water used to water lawns is wasted due to environmental factors like evaporation, wind, and runoff. Overwatering and the fact that most climates aren't right for the grass we grow is the main cause of the overconsumption of water. In many cases, lawns are legally required. With how much land and resources are used to attain green lawns, allowing food for commerce to be grown in our urban areas is a much better use of resources and can be a piece to creating a sustainable food system. I am hopeful that there is a global interest in rebuilding the connection between the consumer and the food producer. Different versions of CSAs are popping up everywhere. Creating local sustainable food systems is needed, especially since the current system faces an ever-growing list of pressures. Before we end, I would be disappointed in myself if I didn't stress how a vegan or plant-based diet can be a sustainable option for a lot of people. This point will probably make listeners mad. As a society, in America, we eat too much meat, and it's not sustainable. Adopting a vegan diet reduces the carbon footprint of a person's diet by 50%. It also requires up to 75% less water than a meat-based diet. Livestock farming occupies 70% of global agricultural land, yet provides only 18% of the world's calories. On a different note, studies suggest that people on plant-based diets have a 16 to 24% lower risk of heart disease, lower risk of certain cancers, and diabetes compared to those consuming American-level meat diets. That's not even mentioning the horrors of concentrated animal feeding operations. So, if you care about the environment and it's feasible for you, consider eating less meat, especially if you live in the United States. To recap, our current food system is broken, but a growing effort exists to fix it. Supporting local food systems and simply eating less meat are some of the easiest individual actions we can take to support sustainable agriculture. That wraps this episode. I want to thank you for tuning in. And if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. Seriously, if you have any questions or comments from this episode, you can find the discussions on social media and contact me via email. Both are linked in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. Remember to subscribe and share the podcast with people you know who are interested in climate progress.